Election Day Eve in the United States. An anxious world waits to see if US foreign policy will be business as usual or heck knows what, and how much of a good democratic example is the US still setting. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you live from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests, Julie Norman here in London and Chris Cermak in Washington, D.C. will brace themselves and the rest of us for what tomorrow may bring. Plus, taking about the most monocle angle we could possibly think of, we'll consider the impact of typefaces on election 2024. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller and I am joined today by Julie Norman, lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Centre on US Politics, and from Washington, D.C. by Chris Cermak, Monocle Radio's senior news editor. Julie, first of all, what is it like being an American abroad when this is being settled?
I would say I think we all feel the anxiety, but I can kind of turn away from it when I need to here. And I think that's a little bit different than people in the US right now who are just all kind of freaking out.
Well, let's talk to an American in America and see if they are freaking out, or indeed if anybody else is. Chris, you and I were both in Washington, D.C. during another marquee event just a few months ago, but God, it seems like centuries, the NATO summit when Joe Biden was still the Democratic president. What does Washington feel like now compared to that? Are you seeing Fortress D.C. being built all over again?
You know, we're not seeing a full Fortress DC being built at this point, but there are a lot of nerves. I think that's certainly fair to say at this point here in the US. I really just can't believe it's here. I mean, that's kind of the simple answer when you say how we're feeling here. After all the setup, after all the time, after all the many changes that we've been through, as you mentioned, that NATO summit, and I'm broadcasting here from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, by the way, and we were just talking about that here, how that NATO summit was such a seminal moment. We all remember Joe Biden's press conference, and yet that seems so long ago now. It's incredible.
Well, we will have more from both of you shortly. Do stick with us. But tomorrow, as you may have read, the United States votes in a presidential election. Any such endeavour is a considerable logistical undertaking. Last time out in 2020, more than 158 million votes were cast. And this time, even more than last time, security is going to be a considerable concern. Passions are running hot ahead of what is anticipated to be a vote so close the result may not be known for some days at least, and one of the candidates does have a record of encouraging violence. Well, I'm joined now by Justin Smith, election security expert and former sheriff of Larimer County, Colorado. He joins us from Grand Junction. Justin, first of all, we've just heard from Chris Cermak about what Election Day might be like in Washington, D.C. What's it likely to be like in Grand Junction?
Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate the opportunity to be on and to share with your listeners. We're really open for, any number of potential issues that could disrupt our elections. Across the vast majority of the United States, we actually expect it to be calm, but certainly the last few years has taught us that there's potential for issues around the country. And so there's just been a lot of effort put into being prepared for any number of things, domestic or foreign, that could disrupt our elections.
I mean, is the greatest danger on the day itself or in the days after, if it is, as it was last time, still uncertain as to who's actually won?
Well, I believe you hit an important point that typically we have a tendency to focus on the day of the election and the actual counting within that day or maybe the day after. But certainly with an election as close, and you're certainly aware of how close it is in so many places in the United States, the period of the next 2 months afterwards, we're really keeping our eye on the ball and making sure that elections officials and local police are prepared, knowing the different points that there could be contention, there could be issues, and especially there's a lot of information about foreign actors, our adversaries out there inserting themselves to create some kind of disruption. So we're really in this for the long on this.
I mean, when we think about lessons which may have been learned from the events of 4 years ago, what do you see across the United States being done differently to deal with various potential outcomes?
Well, Andrew, what I have witnessed, and I've been active in this for a little over 2 years now, is that there are safety plans being put in place across the United States, and you have to keep in mind that while others see our elections as a national election, they're held at a local community level. Counties or cities actually put on the election, report the results up, and in the past, typically safety and security was kind of an afterthought. It was elections officials were focused a lot more on the technical aspects, the dates, how the ballot is done, complying with all those, and appropriately so. But we've seen, and this has actually been a longer term trend than just 2020, but we've seen it advance to the point that they need to have safety plans. We talk about if there's a parade in a community, if there's a community event, there's a safety plan that includes first responders, police, fire, medical. We've just come to a recognition that we're simply in a time in today's era that elections also have to have a safety plan, and that just needs to be work that's done ahead of time. They have to pay attention to things. The most recent were attacks on some ballot collection boxes up in the states of Washington and Oregon, and there's indications that the individual or individuals behind that apparently had another political agenda, a pro-Palestine agenda, and that was the messaging they left behind. So we're certainly concerned that others may hijack this, as it were, and recognize with so many eyes on the U.S. elections that it is potentially an opportunity to promote a cause that has nothing to do with our elections. So we have to be prepared for pretty much anything. And I will say that our local elections officials have really got diligent, as our local law enforcement has, at coming together collaboratively and planning and looking at what those threats are and being prepared for them.
Well, and just finally, and on that front, do you get the sense that preparations are being stepped up in proportion to how close a particular state is likely to be? I mean, Colorado, where you are, is not widely reckoned to be one of the swing states, but in those seven or eight maybe states that are reckoned as swing states, do you get the sense that preparations are more intense?
I believe that's an accurate statement. We traveled the country over the last 2 years and seen that. Certainly what they're referring to as the Rust Belt states, with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. They are so close. I mean, wow, who would have seen polling this close? And they're done so locally that they really are focused on that potential. And certainly I think Pennsylvania has a lot of challenges because the way their election occurs, it typically is taking quite some time. The more early votes and mail-in votes, the longer it's going to take. So certainly all of those are hyper vigilant as to the challenge. But again, I hearken back to Oregon and Washington. Those are two states that honestly the outcome presidentially is pretty clear, as is the state of Oklahoma, where our FBI in the last month announced an indictment of an individual who was plotting an actual terrorist mass attack at a polling location in Oklahoma. And that's not something you would put on the radar. So what we don't want, we don't want people to be, we don't want to be alarmist, but at the same time, you can't be in denial that these things can happen in any number of places.
Sheriff Justin Smith, thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. We will bring our panel back in now. Chris Cermak and Julie Norman. Chris is in DC. Julie is right here in the studio. Chris, the candidates are making their last-ditch pitches. What sense do you get of their priorities? I know the Trump campaign has decided that now is the time to get incredibly agitated about a squirrel. But other than that, what are we hearing from them?
Well, I think when it comes to the Trump campaign, part of the effort today and towards the end of yesterday has been just trying to get Donald Trump back on message. I was at a rally early yesterday morning in Pennsylvania, where he went very much off script and very much purposely off script. He said, this is something I'm only going to do once, as if he knew that his staffers were going to come crawling, trying to pull him off the stage, as he talked about, the possibility of cheating in this election, focusing on the fact that he, in his view, won the last election, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for them, the focus really has been on getting him back on a certain level of message, at least in these last couple of days for those final voters, because at the end of the day, at this point, it is a little bit more about undecided voters, I would say, particularly because you've had the early voting in the US this time around, right? So anyone who is particularly passionate and really knows where they stand, well, they don't matter quite as much right now. Right now, what you want are either those few slivers of undecided voters, although it's very small, or just those that aren't maybe that enthusiastic and aren't yet sure whether they actually want to turn out to vote or not. So that's really what the two campaigns are absolutely focusing on. And also swing states. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are in Pennsylvania today. That is absolutely where this fight is. That is where they are making their final stands. Whoever gets Pennsylvania very, very likely wins this whole election.
Chris, just a quick follow-up to that. There's been a lot of reporting and, well, certainly verifiable footage of Trump's rallies of late, which suggests that they are certainly not as well attended as he insists that they are, and that quite a lot of the people who do turn up don't stand or don't stay for the entire interminable oration. Was that your experience?
The first part was a little bit my experience. There weren't as many people as I might have expected. There was more space at the rally for people to come in from the back, and didn't. Obviously, the seating was taken, but there was more space that could have been taken. Although, of course, Donald Trump said there were, people as far as the eye could see. So anecdotally, yes, at that rally, there could have been more space. In terms of people leaving, I didn't get that impression. I did feel like everyone was pretty much in rapturous attention. But then again, at this point in the election campaign, the people who go to these rallies, the people who I spoke to, some had already voted. Others were very strong supporters. One person I spoke to, this was his 8th rally, 7th or 8th that he had gone to for Donald Trump. So these are people who are the hardcore fans. So I think in that sense, more importantly might be, are people switching off their television? Because he did go on for an hour and 40 minutes at the rally that I was at. So that's the bigger question, I think, than whether people are leaving at the rally itself.
Julie, to bring you in, one omen which appeared to break in quite startling fashion for Vice President Harris over the weekend was the release of the Seltzer poll about Iowa. It is always keenly looked forward to because this particular pollster does have a pretty enviable record of being more or less on the money. And she declared, I think to nobody's greater surprise perhaps than Vice President Harris herself, that she's actually ahead in Iowa, which nobody was even thinking about as a swing state. Now, it put Harris 3 points up in Iowa. If that trend, as various delighted people have been relating on social media, held nationwide, it would be a Harris landslide of absolutely preposterous proportions. How much faith do you think we can place in that?
Well, I would say one thing to point out is that even though the polls are very close, this election could still go all different kinds of directions. There could be a runaway winner, states going ways that we didn't expect, things like that. In terms of this poll, I would say it's important to keep the polls in perspective. Just all polls that we have, they're predictions, they're models, they're not exact. And one poll that's quite clearly an outlier for the others is, I think, one to not read too much into. But again, this idea that the numbers that we're seeing, even as consistent as they've been, the outcome is going to be different. We just don't know which direction it's going to be different. And it's possible that some states will flip in ways we didn't expect. And I'd point out Iowa did go to Barack Obama in both of his elections, even though it is, it's in the Midwest. It's right kind of smack in the middle of the country. Usually it's considered very, very clearly a Republican win. But it's put that back in play, I think, a little bit just because of that poll.
But to follow that up, Julie, one of the reasons people have suggested that Iowa and elsewhere might be in play is an undetected or unacknowledged groundswell of women voting. And women voting not just for what would be the United States' first female president, though that's not an unreasonable motivation, but women voting on the basis of reproductive rights. And indeed, Harris's campaign has not only been suggesting that there might be women telling their husband one thing about how they're voting and then voting in the other direction, but actually kind of trying to encourage that.
Yeah, I mean, gender has been very interesting in this election, not only, as you said, the first, obviously, female, potential female president, but one, this idea of reproductive rights that the Democrats have dug into, but also Trump really leaning into reaching out to men, young men, going on platforms that really reach out to that demographic. So you have a courting by the Democrats at the same time as a potential alienation by Republicans. So we are seeing that divide. And Democrats, I think, really lent into that. People may have heard of an ad that came out over the weekend kind of telling women you can kind of vote in secret. You don't have to tell your husband what you're voting for. And that was, I would say that was rather controversial. People responded very differently to that ad, but you can see them really leaning into that angle in different ways.
Well, let's draw our focus slightly outwards, because a US presidential election is a global event, because a US presidential election has global consequences. It is not an exaggeration to suggest that the whims of a few thousand citizens of Arizona or Wisconsin could be the difference between life and death for at least that number of Ukrainians, Taiwanese and Palestinians. The latter issue has been a particular difficulty for Democrats, as President Joe Biden has tried to reconcile his country's traditional support for Israel with his party's increasing sympathy with Gaza. Here is how Vice President Harris has tried to unravel this particular knot.
And I want to say this year has been difficult, given the scale of death and destruction in Gaza and given the civilian casualties and displacement in Lebanon. It is devastating. And as president, I will do everything in my power to end the war in Gaza.
Julie, one thing, well, as with all aspects of foreign policy and indeed all aspects of policy, one thing to say it, another thing entirely to actually do it. Are we clear how she would go about ending the war in Gaza?
We are absolutely not. It was notable that she said this. She needed to say it, and she needed to say it in Michigan. So I understand politically why she did. But she followed it with the points that she said consistently through the campaign, that there needs to be security for Israel, return of the hostages, and also an end to the war and dignity and self-determination for Palestinians. So all those, I think, many people could get behind, but trying to balance those priorities and to have any kind of leverage over what's really happening in the region in a way that Biden has not been able or willing to do, I think that's still a question mark. In terms of actual policy, it seems like she would most likely still walk the line that Biden has, and the conflict itself, again, is playing out on its own on the ground and in somewhat unforeseen ways. So I think it will be hard for her to somehow reel that in.
Chris, to bring you in, most presidential candidates, of course, have years to establish some sort of idea of what their view of the world is, what their view of America's role in the world is, of themselves as a foreign policy player, and of the doctrine that might be established in their name. Kamala Harris, for reasons we were recalling at the top of the show, has had a matter of months. Do we have a clear idea yet what a Harris doctrine might look like and how it might be different in any way from the Biden doctrine?
I don't think we really do, to be honest, Andrew. People have spoken to here about America's role in the world and how the different administrations will look on foreign policy, generally tend to say exactly what you told me not to say. In other words, well, she'll be a continuation of the Biden administration and her policies. So there is a lot of focus on that. She has sort of parroted, if you will, a fair amount of that. The good side's talking about the importance of alliances in the U.S., the importance of America's engagement in the world, staying and engaged in Ukraine. She has shown maybe a little bit more of that humanitarian side in some of her focus on Gaza compared to Joe Biden. The other thing I would say, though, and this was particularly interesting from one person I spoke to last week, Fred Kemp of the Atlantic Council, he was talking about the fact that Kamala Harris would be the first president, compared to, say, a Joe Biden, who didn't even really grow up politically, at least in the Cold War. So you would see a subtle shift there, potentially, in terms of her priorities compared to, say, a Joe Biden, who really brought this Cold War mentality, the importance of the fight of the Soviet Union against the United States States, and maybe you see some of that in his rhetoric on Ukraine. That's something that Kamala Harris doesn't have. So that maybe makes her a little bit more unpredictable on foreign policy. She's part of a new generation, so exactly where she's going to go remains a little bit up in the air.
We should look at the other side of this equation, Julie, and that is the prospect that Donald Trump will be returned and will once again lead, after a fashion, the free world. We obviously have had 4 years of Donald Trump being a foreign policy president, but Trump being Trump, does that actually tell us anything? I mean, is there really any point in trying to assess how he's going to react to any given situation?
It's really hard to say. I mean, just as much as Harris is very unknown in this sphere, Trump is just very unpredictable in this sphere, and we saw that in his first term. With that said, I think some of the issues that people care the most about, he has been pretty outspoken on Ukraine about wanting to end the war in a day, about not wanting to continue aid to Ukraine. I think Europe has been, bracing for that. And on the Middle East as well, he left office in 2020 with a Middle East so-called peace plan on the table that I think he would very likely revive. And that is very much on the minds of people in the region who I speak to about, potential changes in the West Bank, not only in Gaza. So we can look at some hints from his first term and then just what he's been saying. But at the end of the day, Trump is unpredictable, has more this America First posturing that we just don't know exactly where that will lead him on all issues.
And Chris, in the conversations you've been having with foreign policy boffins in Washington, D.C., what are their hopes/fears/expectations of what Trump's second term might mean in that respect?
Well, I think a lot of the focus right now is just on the quality of leadership in the United States. Some people I spoke to lament that basically people aren't making the case to the United States about what leadership is like, what they're going to have to prepare themselves for in the coming years, given all of the geopolitical crises out there. And that's a point. We can play a little clip from Heather Conley. She's the former president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, currently a senior advisor, and they are my hosts currently for this daily program. So let's have a little listen to what she said.
But if you have the American people who are focusing rightly on, their kids and the grocery bills, you've got to help connect the local to the global. But that takes a whole bunch of leaders locally and in Washington to help them understand what's at stake. No one's going to do this for them.
Do we have enough leaders willing to make that effort?
So you put your finger on, we see this transatlantically. We see this, in the democratic Western world, this lack of leadership. It's the courage to say, this is tough, but we've got to face this. We have to do hard things. But once we get through these hard things, hold me accountable for what we've seen. You see, afraid of the politics, afraid to lean into those important arguments. It's easy for me. I am the Monday morning quarterback analyzing the plays. It's very hard. But I think you're right. We need to make sure we have a generation of leaders that are not only going to, give us the rhetoric, that are going to be able to stick to their words and implement. And I think, again, with Mr. Trump, he's highlighted some of the hypocrisy, which was prevalent. But again, these aren't simple answers. This is tough sacrifice. We are in a moment internationally, globally, that demands strong leadership, courage, and sacrifice. And I hope our citizens are preparing themselves for that.
Heather Conley at the German Marshall Fund speaking to Chris Cermak. And Chris and Julie, thank you both for the moment. We will have more from you shortly. Now to South Carolina, which is not a swing state. If Donald Trump does not carry its 9 electoral college votes, he will have had a very bad day indeed. Nevertheless, Monocle's Geogina Godwin is there now. Georgina, first of all, explain your reasons for being there. What are you up to?
So I'm actually at a literary festival, just speaking to authors, which has been absolutely wonderful. But there have been a lot of other things going on around it, of course, because as you point out, South Carolina, we're in Trump country. And there's a historical reason why this is important. So at around 4:30 in the morning on April the 12th, 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, and less than 34 hours later, Union forces surrendered. Now, traditionally, that event has been used to mark the beginning of the Civil War. So I went for a walk around there early in the morning, and I came across a man called Braxton D. Spivey, who was flying the Confederate flag, very triggering flag for many people, and clearly hoping that the opening salvo of the next war for the soul of America is about to be fired. So I asked him what he thinks will happen if Trump wins.
My theory is if Trump wins, we'll probably see a lot of riots. If Trump loses, I'm hoping the American people will stand up and we could very possibly have a war. But I think the people need to stand up and say we've had enough. It's going to take the American citizens to stand up and say we've had enough. We're tired of dealing with a tyrannical government.
Georgina, did he elaborate at all on what it was about living in Earth's most wealthy, powerful and fortunate nation that he was especially tired of?
I did press him a lot on this and just asked him what it was that he thought was so bad about an incoming Harris administration and why he thought Trump would be so great. This is a man who has drunk the Kool-Aid. He was deeply, deeply steeped in conspiracy theories, and from everything about the Civil War not being about slavery, it was all about taxes. I mean, we know that there was an element of taxes in that, but he was denying that the death of George Floyd was caused by a police officer and various other highly questionable and very objectionable views. But I mean, the point is that he was very, very into his conspiracy theories. And I thought that was interesting because on the latest episode of Meet the Writers, I spoke to Gabriel Gatehouse. Now, he's the former international editor of Newsnight, and he's written this book and indeed done a podcast called The Coming Storm. So on Meet the Writers, we spoke about that. And he was speaking about how actually at the beginning of every conspiracy theory, there is a grain of truth. He was, talking about, the pedophile network or whatever, but then saying, okay, well, is there a link back to Jeffrey Epstein, for instance? So he was very interesting on that. But then, so now I'm on the move. I've actually left South Carolina and we're driving through Georgia right now. We're on the Appalachian Way. And we went through Covington, which is a place people might know from the Vampire Diaries. I have never watched the Vampire Diaries and found myself slightly alarmed to be in the middle of what essentially was a film set. We stayed in a place called 12 Oaks, which people who love Gone with the Wind will recognize as the homestead of Ashley Wilkes, Scarlett O'Hara's love interest. And I thought that was also really interesting because here in the South, they've really brought into that. And if you read Sarah Churchwell's book, The Wrath to Come, Gone with the Wind and the Lies America Tells, this is all about Margaret Mitchell's book, which was an instant bestseller when it was published in 1936. The film version became the most successful Hollywood movie of all time. And it's about the history of myth-making and how this has informed America's racial and gender politics. She charts 160 years of American denialism, essentially. And so what we're seeing here is that there's a link between the conspiracy theories, this whole idea of the genteel South and these great big plantation houses. I mean, the place we stayed, I was in the Scarlett O'Hara Frankly My Dear suite, which was quite extraordinary. And my main sort of takeaway from all of that is how important history is to this part of the world, to the southern states of America, but also for what happens next. And I mean, right now, it's stunningly beautiful where we are. We're on the Appalachian Parkway. We're driving up through the Smoky Mountains. Incidentally, this is apparently the home of Bigfoot. But if that is the case, I have to say I haven't found him yeti.
Oh, Georgina, you worked on that for some time, didn't you? That's what you've been doing on that long drive. The whole thing has been a build-up to a punchline, which, frankly, I would have been embarrassed by, Georgina. Before you go and sit in a corner and have a long think about what you've just put our listeners through, do please tell us how you will be spending Election Day.
Andrew, it's so exciting because we just don't know. We're on the road. We've just gone through this very bizarre town called Helen, which is basically a sort of German theme town. They've got like a permanent Oktoberfest going on, and everywhere's called like Heidi's Cottage and things like that. It's also the home of the heart-shaped jacuzzi, I'm reliably informed. So we're kind of heading up. We're heading towards Alabama, Tennessee. So we're going through there. I imagine we will be, we're hoping to kind of hit Mississippi by then. And I think that will be a very, very interesting place to spend election day. I mean, everywhere we go, there's little snatches of conversation. We stopped at a diner and the proprietor was telling his staff that they had to vote tomorrow. And he said, unless you do, we're all going to be speaking Chinese in 4 years. I mean, it's just alarming.
I mean, he clearly has enormous faith in the intellectual capacities of his patrons, though. Learning Chinese in 4 years would be no small undertaking at all. I, for one, would be enormously impressed. Georgina, we look forward massively to hearing a great deal more about your trip. Please do enjoy. You've honestly made me incredibly jealous. You are travelling through one of my very, very favourite parts of the United States. We will now bring Julie Norman and Chris Cermak back in, and pretty much every US president other than the one before the present incumbent has sought to brandish the country as a beacon of democracy. Reagan called it a shining city on a hill. Kennedy said the US would bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty. George W. Bush believed the survival of American liberty depended on the expansion of freedom elsewhere. And though there has frequently been a gap between theory and practice on this front, an American election is a test of democracy like no other, and this one more than any, given the declared and demonstrated indifference of one candidate to the concept. Julie, there are many frustratingly obvious questions that can be asked about the rise to prominence of Donald Trump, now contesting his third presidential election campaign. And in every single one of those, he has refused to promise that he would acknowledge the result. In one instance, obviously, he attempted to overturn it. How has this not been completely disqualifying?
I mean, I think that's the big question for so many people, because many will say that Trump's policies they actually, find somewhat even moderate, not too different from any other Republicans, so to speak. But when it comes down to January 6th, the attempts to overturn the election, I think that's where you do get that proportion of never-Trumpers, people who otherwise would vote Republican. But obviously it hasn't swayed many Americans, and many who simply don't trust institutions anymore and don't trust elections anymore and don't trust elite media like our radio shows and that kind of thing anymore. And so the more that he kind of bangs against those, the more that they want to follow him. But it's a very dangerous trajectory, and it's one that I would say is much bigger than Trump now. We've heard reports of volunteers kind of across the country who are going to be questioning certification, who are going to be kind of out there like volunteering on his behalf, even before he kind of contests or makes a call about it.
I mean, the question then becomes, Chris, is does this lack of faith, indeed lack of interest displayed by many Americans at least in the idea of democracy, does it undermine efforts the United States makes abroad to encourage democracy?
Well, it's a good question. First of all, though, I would say, having spent some time also with the conservatives, what has become so difficult about this in the US is that both sides do believe they are defending democracy, right? So it's not necessarily that conservatives don't care about democracy if they're voting for Donald Trump. They have bought into this idea that an election has been stolen. And then you have so many, it's just impossible to underestimate, I think, for listeners around the world as well, how many other people you have here in the United States who are backing that up. Politicians, media personalities, the Tucker Carlsons of this world, the Steve Bannons of this world, with, hundreds of thousands, millions of listeners, the Sean Hannitys of this world. They are all backing this kind of rhetoric from Donald Trump and making it believable, therefore, to conservatives. And when it does come to the world and how the world is watching it, it is absolutely a concern. And that's something we can play a little clip because I spoke to Tony Banbury. He's the president and chief executive officer of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And he or his organization is actually bringing election officials from around the world to Washington, D.C. today, tomorrow, and Wednesday to watch the results, not to monitor or observe them. He stresses that very importantly. That's not their role, but just to watch and learn from it. And he did talk a little bit about some of the concerns that they have. Let's have a listen.
People around the world are really shaken by what they've seen in the U.S., certainly from 2020 and January 6th. It shocked Americans. It shocked people around the world who had an image of the U.S. not as some perfect democracy. I think these are smart people. They're realistic. So they saw in the U.S. a flawed model, but one that was still to be emulated, respected, looked up to. Now there's much more uncertainty about the durability of the U.S. model, the strength of the U.S. model, whether it's institutions or processes or norms, all of which have come under a little bit of attack and have wobbled a bit. And when there's a wobble in the U.S. democracy, it's a wobble that's felt around the world.
That was Tony Banbury at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems speaking to Chris Cermak. Julie, on that idea that Tony Banbury enumerates there of a wobble that's felt around the world, does, I guess, a perceived lack of faith in democracy among Americans open up a space internationally for that an axis of demagoguery to operate? Russia, China, who are then able to say, look, democracy is clearly not that big a deal. Even Americans don't want it.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And I would say if it's just a one-off, it was just 2020, I think the U.S. can get past that to a point. But if it happens again this time around, if we have that consecutive challenge to the election, of course, America's foes around the world are going to lean into that and exploit it as much as possible, not only for what it means for the U.S., but what it means for kind of the world order moving forward. And I would point out this isn't divorced from what the U.S.'s policies are overseas, and I think the last guest just kind of referred to that in general, but especially around the Gaza war, most of the world sees the U.S. as very complicit in that. And so at this particular moment, you don't need that much to nudge people much further to having a very negative view of the U.S. and U.S. democracy.
Well, just before I let you both go, I'm not going to ask either of you to try and pick the result because, as I think we've pretty firmly established, we are very much in anybody's guess is as good as anybody else's territory. But I want to ask you first of all, Chris, in the nation's capital, how you'll be spending Election Day. What are you going to be doing?
Well, Andrew, we're going to be live from Washington, D.C. for the series of shows, all of our shows tomorrow coming out of Washington, D.C., or rather, sorry, all of our shows Wednesday, I should say. It gets a little confusing with time zones, but starting with the Globalists on Wednesday at 2 a.m, as it were here, we will be live and we'll be doing shows through that. We'll also have the Monocle Daily from here tomorrow. So we're really just going to be speaking to as many people as we can about the result, about what they think about the result, what they think about the state of democracy and the U.S. role in the world. So it's going to be an interesting time. We're going to be at 815 Connecticut Avenue. It's very close to the White House with a bunch of other reporters. There'll be CNN will be there, various international outlets as well. So it'll be interesting to get impressions from different places. Nikkei's offices are right there. Different impressions from different journalists and others around the world of what they think of this too.
And Julie, how does an American abroad here in London brace for election night? Have you booked Wednesday off? Have you laid in a big box of Krispy Kremes and a bottle of bourbon? How are you dealing with this?
Well, I will say, I mean, because the whole world is watching this election, as we've established, there's like loads of watch parties across London. So I feel like it's going to be a fun night to be watching from here, as well as doing some commentating. And I'm trying to finish a book manuscript for Thursday also, so I'll be working on that.
Julie Norman, Godwin and Chris Cermak, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, a different look at the US presidential election, specifically the role of typeface in campaigns. Which tropes have been embraced in the visual identities in this year's race? And why might some of those design decisions look a little familiar? To find out, Monocle's Maylee Evans spoke with Charles Nix, designer, typographer and senior executive creative director at Monotype.
We have a selective typographic baggage, especially in the United States around campaigns, that grows out of what was available in type when television was introduced. Kennedy. When visual media became a thing, we had a lot of very large sans serif wood type. That was the largest type available because it was physical type that needed to be printed. And so you end up with a lot of expectation around political posters and signage and campaigns, hearkening back to this initial idea. Now we have access to digital font files that we can set as large or as small as we want, but we still fall back on this sort of idea of an authentic campaign consisting of really large sans serif typography. This year's election, I think they fit very much into the mode that we've come to expect over the last 100 years, maybe even longer in typography for campaigns. Lots of all caps, lots of sans serif, and everything as large as possible. The sort of simplicity of that cuts through. We know when we type emails to one another that if we type in all caps, that we're shouting. This is the mode for political campaigns. It's all caps all the time. If we took the typographic lessons we know from other parts of our lives and applied it to this, it's that simplicity of a very loud voice in a very simple type. That's what's at the core of it. That's the thing that you know will march through all of the different iterations, maintain itself. What happens around the periphery of it, the sort of remixing, the different color schemes that get applied, the different places it shows up on hats and t-shirts and on tote bags, all of that is besides the big, giant, immediate simplicity of it. When one thinks about the typography of campaigns, it's the connection of the typography to the individual who's running. If there seems to be an authentic connection, for instance, if we take the previous Trump campaign where he was simply using Arial bold, it was very authentic to this devil-may-care kind of attitude of the campaign.
We're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world.
It was sort of breaking down traditional notions. And so using something really unexpectedly under-designed was very much in keeping with the nature of the campaign. The typeface Gotham is almost synonymous with the first 2 decades of the 21st century. It came along at a time when all of us were becoming aware of our lives becoming increasingly digital. And it's so associated with that period of our sort of human evolution. When it was adopted by the Obama campaign, it became supercharged. It was a sort of embodiment typographically of the optimism that we all felt about this century, but also the candidate of Barack Obama. And so it was a perfect marriage typographically for the time and for the candidate. This year, the Trump campaign has adopted Gotham, or something at least very Gotham-esque, moving more towards a formula that worked 20 years ago, the cleaned up version of their previous incarnation, which in a way is inauthentic, but at the same time, it's a design trope. They're leaning on something that makes them look a little more put together, but ironically, it's the same typeface that Barack Obama used so many years ago.
This is so consistent about Donald Trump. He puts himself before the needs of others. I fear that he really lacks empathy.
What's most interesting about the Harris Waltz typographic aspect is that this has come together as a campaign at really breakneck speed. Like normally there would be plenty of sort of focus group testing and plenty of options available, but this had to be created really quick. It's not just any type that they've chosen. They've chosen a very condensed sans serif type very much in the sort of Franklin Gothic extra condensed model that we see in posters for like Chisholm in 1972.
What's wrong with my running for president of this country? After all, for 15 years, I have been the ghostwriter for a lot of them.
It's unadorned, it's large, does what it needs to, which is speak with immediacy, a sense of urgency about how this campaign came together so quickly. What I find most interesting of late is how much more present variations on that typography are than the actual typography that they chose. And so we're starting to see people sort of picking up the idea, but making their own versions of it.
You will have the chance to make a decision that directly impacts your life, the life of your family, and the future of this country we love.
There are a whole series of Harris Waltz campaign posters that look like the Trump posters from the previous election. The reason for that is troubling and amazing at the same time. And I know that there are places in this country where hanging out a Harris Waltz sign could get you in a lot of trouble with your neighbors who are Trump supporters. And so adopting the character of the Trump campaign in order to say the words of Harris Waltz is, it's an interesting thing that's going on there.
I have said many times publicly, and I'll say it again, in many, many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of him being president of the United States are brutally serious.
It's sort of troubling that they feel threatened to the degree that they have to code their support for Harrison Waltz in the clothing of a Trump campaign poster, while at the same time feeling the sort of dire necessity of broadcasting that they support Harrison Waltz.
Oh, you guys are at the wrong rally.
There is a subtle sort of psychological rub that's going on with this typography. For the non-typographer, it is a series of details in the typography that add up to a message on top of the actual language. It's most akin to the clothing that we choose to wear and what kind of message that sends about us. Clothing is semiotic. It's a sign unto itself. And we all can read things like a three-piece suit. We know what a little black dress means and a pair of blue jeans and a t-shirt. We have expectations that come along with those pieces of clothing about who wears them and what the circumstances are and what they're projecting. It's similar with typefaces. There's an underlying skeleton there, but the clothing that you put on top of it sends this subtle signal to those who read it about the person or the organization that put together that message. It's a little more subtle than clothing, but it's like the difference between a handmade suit and an off-the-rack suit. There are subtle differences that all of us are picking up on, whether we're cognizant of it or not.
Charles Nix at Monotype speaking to Maylee Evans, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Julie Norman and Chris Cermak, also to Georgina Godwin. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and Chris Cermak and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Mullett here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.